What up, though? Let's revisit the DNA aspect of genealogical ancestry and or its shortcomings. It'd be ideal if we could have spoke to all our older family members and amassed a vast library of transcribed dates, people, and places, who we are, the earth soil portion we come from, our origins, our travels, our family and connections. History of genetic genealogy. This is from isogg.org. Genetic genealogy is the application of genetics to traditional genealogy. DNA testing for family historians became available on a commercial basis in the year 2000. The earliest use of the term genetic genealogy found to date was on February 20th, 1989, in an article by Tom Siegfried in the Dallas Morning News entitled Genetic Genealogy and the Search for Eve. The next recorded reference was in June 1996 when Helen Sensbo gave a presentation on the subject of genetic genealogy at the Federation of East European Family History Societies Conference in June 1996 in Minneapolis. The first published reference to the use of the term in the context of a surname DNA project was on November 9th, 1998, with the publication of an online article entitled An Introduction to Genetic Genealogy by the genealogist Alan Savin, who launched the first surname project by a genealogy hobbyist in 1997. The investigation of surnames in genetics can be said to go back to George Darwin, a son of Charles Darwin. In 1875, George Darwin used surnames to estimate the frequency of first cousin marriages and calculated the expected incidence of marriage between people of the same surname. Isonomy. His parents, Charles Darwin and Emma Wedgwood, were first cousins. The next stimulus toward using genetics to study family history had to wait until the 1990s. In May 2000, Family Tree DNA in Houston, Texas, began offering the first genetic genealogy test to the public. This offering marked the first time that a personal theory on the Y chromosome could be tested outside of an academic study. In the same month, Brian Sykes launched Oxford Ancestors, based in Oxford, England. The company was launched in anticipation of the expected demand for mitochondrial DNA tests from the publication of Sykes' book, The Seven Daughters of Eve, which appeared in the spring of 2001. The book described the seven major mitochondrial DNA haplogroups of European ancestors. With the growing availability and affordability of genealogical DNA testing, genetic genealogy as a field began growing rapidly. By 2003, the field of DNA testing of surnames was declared officially to have arrived in an article by Jobling and Tyler Smith in Nature Reviews Genetics. The number of firms offering tests and the number of consumers ordering them had risen dramatically. The Genographic Project is a 5-year research study launched in 2005 by the National Geographic Society and IBM in partnership with the University of Arizona and Family Tree DNA. Its goals are primarily anthropological, not genealogical. The project's sale by October 2007 of more than 225,000 of its public participation testing kits. By 2006, annual sales of by 2006, annual sales of genetic genealogical tests for all companies, including the laboratories that support them, were estimated to be in the area of $60 million. Roberta Estes, Genetic Genealogy Interview. Roberta Estes of DNA Explain. Roberta retired from information technology consulting several years ago to become a full-time genetic genealogy professional. In addition to my own genealogy, I wrote the personalized DNA report for Family Tree DNA. I enjoy doing this a great deal because I get to spend some concerted time and effort working to help someone better understand genetic genealogy and their own test results. The part I love the best is putting the history, genealogy, and genetics together for them. When I was pregnant with my daughter, I wasn't working, and I decided that I wanted to learn something about my father's side of the family. He died in a car accident in 1963, and I did not grow up near any of his family. So they seemed like a very interesting mystery. I didn't even know that name. I didn't even know that name of what I was beginning to do was genealogy. I just wanted to know about my family. I'm glad I started when I did because all of the older people I met then that did know about my family history are long gone now. Sounds familiar. I was a very early adopter of genetic genealogy. I first tested myself and my husband. I formed the Estes Surname Project in 2002. I have taken all the mainstream commercial tests available in the genetic genealogy space, with the exception of the Y test, of course. I have cousins sit proxy for me for those tests. The interviewer, Rebecca, have you tested family members? Anyone who will swab? Have you ever been surprised by your or your family's test results? The biggest surprise has been that my brother, who I knew existed but didn't know who he was, when found, didn't match the family Estes Y DNA. At that time, autosomal DNA testing, as we know it today, didn't exist. So we took an older type of test, but the results were inconclusive. The first day autosomal testing was introduced for genealogy, you can bet that I purchased 2 test kits. When the results came back, it was evident that we were not half siblings. By that time, I certainly loved him, and the DNA aspect didn't change a thing between us. However, I then realized that maybe Dave was my father's child and I wasn't. I talked about that desperation and how I even considered exhuming my father to find out. I didn't exhume Dad, and I loved Dave just as much as if he had been my big brother. Has genetic genealogy helped you break through any of your brick walls or solve a family mystery? What advice would you give someone starting out in genealogy or personal ancestry DNA testing? I see a lot of people who are very excited about their foray into genetic genealogy, but they have they have misset expectations that one test will give you a family tree. Based on the changes I've seen in the past 14 or 15 years of genetic genealogy, I expect that after we can bring the cost of sequencing the human genome under the $1,000 mark, that we will make another huge advance in genetic genealogy. I hope that one day we can reconstruct our ancestors via the DNA passed to their descendants, and we truly will be able to take a DNA test and receive a tree. Autosomal DNA testing. Successfully using autosomal testing in conjunction with mitochondrial and Y line testing to address genealogical questions. Written by Roberta Estes. Copyright 2007 to 2010. Scientists tell us that 25% or more admixture from any particular ethnic group will show in physical traits. In American history, unfortunately, the records pertaining to Native Americans and sometimes African Americans as well are non existent, disguised or buried in some other obscure record. In the case of Native Americans, those who were reservation Indians were taxed, and therefore we have absolutely no record of their existence. Many did not adopt European last names. Free people of color who are identified as being Indian, African, or mulatto, which meant any admixture of Indian European. Poor white sharecroppers often work side by side with free people of color, both attempting to scratch a living from their marginalized circumstances. Money was required for all of these transactions, including obtaining a marriage license, which probably explains many missing records. During the time of the Europeans' indenture, they often lived and worked in the slave population on the plantation. Slave, worker, laborer, employee. Owners of slaves who were bond for life, tended to treat them somewhat more humanely than indentured servants, if the circumstances under which slaves lived can be described in that manner at all, because they had a financial investment in their continued health. A sick or dead slave was worth nothing, or worse, was a liability. Indian and African slaves were generally not viewed or recorded differently. The genealogy of former slaves is most often unknown. Why is that? The genealogy of former workers, of former laborers, of former employees is most often unknown. What we're doing here is a part two to DNA ancestry results. Today, we won't get caught up in deciphering the hijack or deciphering what is meant by these terms: Indian, African, slave. We've been over that. We've been over that in depth. Let's shake it. Slave genealogical records can be found in the deed records, as slaves, when sold, were often recorded as deeds, wills, and estate settlements, and also on the slave census schedules of 1850 and 1860. While most people whose ancestors were slave know they are of African descent, what they don't realize is that they are also very likely of American Indian descent as well. Listen to what is said here. While most people, and I know I'm a sidebar, while most people whose ancestors were slaves know they are of African descent. And why do they know that? Because the propaganda is strong to this day. What they don't realize is that they are also very likely of American Indian descent as well. Again, I don't want to get caught up today in unveiling this hijack of these words. We've already been through this. I've been through this in depth. Go back and look at my previous shows. Let's shake it. American Indian tribes were constantly at war among themselves. Who today is always into it with one another? Across America. Prior to the settlement of Europeans, they either killed their primary male captives, incorporated them into their tribe, or enslaved them themselves. After European settlement began, Indians quickly discovered a market for their captives, and they began capturing men, women, and children and selling their captives into bondage. After European settlement began, American Indians quickly discovered a market for their captives, and they began capturing men, women, and children and selling their captives into bondage. You'll understand his story better if you understand and know your story. Because as of right now, if you read history, sometimes it's confusing, sometimes it's a bit much because you don't understand where you are within that story. By selling their captives to Europeans, those not sent to the West Indies were no longer within the indigenous population, but were effectively now within what would become the African slave population. Both American Indian and European heritage would become obscured by the African heritage. Sidebar: Native Americans and Africans have been enslaved together on the American soil since at least 1619 in Jamestown, when the first slave ships arrived. I spoke about Jamestown 1619 in a previous show. Go check out my shows. I spoke about before that in 1619, it was said that 20 and odd Africans landed in Jamestown. Before that, it said 20 and odd Negroes. And before that, it said 20 and odd Negras, women, girls. Bondage itself was considered evidence of African heritage. Bondage itself was considered evidence of African heritage. So bondage and African is synonymous. Historically, Native peoples were classified as non-white. Native only means that you were born somewhere. DNA testing is not accepted by any tribe for membership. I wonder why. Each tribe has its own membership criteria, and to my knowledge, none accept DNA as either proof or disproof. Because if they did, and they took DNA, it might prove or disprove something really important. Tribes typically require a percent of blood quantum, such as 1/4 or 1/8. And in addition, they generally require that you be of proven descent from an individual about whom there is no question of their tribal native heritage. Tribes typically require a percent of blood quantum, such as 1/4 or 1/8, 1/4 or 1/8 of a particular type of blood. When you figure out how to figure out a person's nationality or ethnicity or where they come from based on a portion of their blood, let me know. In addition, they generally require that you be of proven descent from an individual about whom there is no question of their tribal native heritage. So a person who is legit in terms of being a part of a tribe, you have to be a descendant from that person. Regardless of, listen, let's not get into it today. Go back and look at my previous shows. This is about DNA ancestry results. Conceptually, this means that you could very well be mostly Native American, with 7 of your 8 direct great-grandparents being 100% Native American, but your father's direct paternal line being European. A recent entry into the field of consumer genetic testing is the firm 23andMe, owned by the wife of Google's founder. They are focused on testing that is not just for ancestry, but includes a significant amount of medical information. This is not equivalent to genetic genealogy testing, as there is no matching with others by surname, projects, and etc. What this does offer is a much wider range of tests on 580,000 locations on your genome. Today, you can't separate out the medical and ancestry testing. So if you don't want the medical, you're getting it anyway. Take a look at their website. The price is about $400. In addition to your Y-line haplogroup for males and your mitochondrial DNA haplogroup, they also provide consumers with an estimation of their percentage of ancestry, although they only include European, Asian, and African, and their sample size is small. In many cases, about 50 individuals per population, which I feel is much too small to be reliable. They recently introduced a feature called Native Ancestry Finder that evaluates your mitochondrial DNA and Y-line haplogroups, plus your percent of Asian heritage, and tells you whether or not you're likely to have native ancestry. Plus your percent of Asian heritage, and tells you whether or not you're likely to have native ancestry. Asia, Native American. Asia, Native American. What is the correlation, if any? There are only 2 tests that can provide you with solid evidence of the source of your Native American or other ethnic ancestry. Those are Y-line and mitochondrial DNA test. It's important to try to fill in the blanks in your family tree pedigree chart by testing relatives who carry the Y-line and or mitochondrial DNA of the lines of your tree that you cannot personally be tested for. DNA print provided percentages of ethnicity of the four major world groups: European, Asian, African, and Native American. Again, dodge this hijack. At one point in history, they divided the world in four quadrants, and it was Europe, Asia, Africa, and America, not Native American. If you're American, why would you need to say you're Native American? Wouldn't you just say you're American and then get more specific with your family's name? Let's shake it. But they are no longer in business. Decode Me and 23andMe provide something slightly similar in their predictions, but neither tests for native ancestry. People of European descent must allow Asian heritage to infer native ancestry. People of European descent must allow Asian heritage to infer Native American ancestry. Again, Asian and Native American, the correlation. All genetic genealogy results need to be accompanied by genealogical research to unravel the historical context for the lives and traits, the lives and trials of our ancestors. All genetic genealogy results need to be accompanied by genealogical research to unravel the historical context for the lives and trials of our ancestors. Roberta Estes, copyright 2007 to 2010. Roberta Estes, all rights reserved. Let's shake it. Genealogy gems. Why Your Genetic Family Tree is Not the Same as Your Family Tree by Lisa Cook, 2017. Your genetic pedigree contains only those ancestors for whom you have received some of their DNA. You do not have DNA from all of your ancestors. Using some fancy math, we can calculate that the average generation in which you start to see that you have inherited 0 blocks of DNA from an ancestor is about 7. Only half of the time your DNA will tell you what your paper trail might have already figured out. You have an average 940 fourth cousins. So if you are only sharing DNA with 470 of them, that's not quite so bad, is it? And it only takes 1 or 2 of them to be tested and show up on your match list. This genetic family tree not matching up exactly with your traditional family tree also manifests itself in your ethnicity results. This DNA stuff is not a standalone tool. Just because a cousin doesn't show a match in DNA, it doesn't mean there isn't a genealogical connection. Genealogical research and primary sources can still prove connections even if DNA doesn't show it. We're moving on to Trentino genealogy. Why DNA tests are no substitute for genealogical research. 2019. Lynn Seraphin. TrentinoGenealogy.com. Genealogist Lynn Seraphin explains why DNA tests alone cannot tell us everything about our ancestry. This article series has been written in response to the hundreds of questions and comments I have personally received or read on social media around the matter of DNA tests. It is a response to the many discussions about recent changes in Ancestry DNA's algorithms, which caused many people to receive ethnicity reports that made no sense to them. People often develop misunderstandings about the purpose and value of DNA tests due to the misleading presentations in the media. DNA testing is not a substitute for genealogical research. Do you want to know your ethnicity, meet living relatives, or find out who your great-grandfather was? These are all very different objectives, and that DNA testing might shed light on some of them, but not all, and not consistently from company to company. Based on what he had seen in the media, he had formed a belief that DNA testing was the key to unlocking all these mysteries. Most people who are new to the idea of DNA testing seem to have developed similar misconceptions, largely based on misleading suggestions in advertising and television programs. Many people I meet also have the impression that science, i.e., DNA testing, can give them answers to genealogical questions, i.e., names and details about specific ancestors. This simply isn't true. Using DNA tests, there is one important condition without which none of this would be possible. Both parties need to have done a DNA test through the same testing provider. And therein lies the fly in the ointment. When we are seeking to connect or reconnect with close family, no DNA test can help us unless the other party or someone closely related to that person has their DNA in the same database as ours. The only alternative we have is to use traditional paper trail genealogical research, which is very specific, and it does take time, but it's extremely fulfilling. You should try it. DNA cannot fill in the blanks without at least having tried to construct a tree or hiring a genealogist to do the research for them. DNA is not the tool that will help me solve that puzzle. Genealogy is. You can be related to someone and not show up as DNA matches in DNA test websites. Whether we don't actually share any DNA or the DNA we do share is beyond the current abilities of DNA testing technology, we have all done exhaustive, well-documented genealogical research, and we are 100% certain of our blood connections. Genealogy does require incredible patience. Yes, it does. It does require fine attention to detail, indeed, and an obsessive passion for solving puzzles. It requires you to be able to hold a great deal of information in your head and to make connections between those pieces of information, sometimes years after you've recorded it. This kind of thinking truly is in sharp contrast to our modern I want it now mentality, where 80% of people click away from a website if it takes more than a few seconds to load. DNA testing companies know this about us. They know we are impatient. They know we want it all now. And they also know our society, especially those who have lost connection with their blood relations and or ancestral homelands. And they also know, DNA companies, they also know DNA testing companies also know our society, especially those who have lost connections with their blood relations and or ancestral homelands. Who cares where we come from? Who cares what we call ourselves? At what point does one go from knowing who he or she is to searching for who you are? It's refreshing to know. Do the right thing.